Let's talk fat quarter friendly patterns. These are by far the most popular and most in-demand quilt patterns. So if you can add a fat quarter friendly option to your pattern, definitely do that. People love these things. I don't know what it is about it, but it is just so easy to grab a fat quarter bundle and just dive into a quilt with a little bit of background. It's so much fun. They're usually super quick sews as well. But these patterns can be really tricky to write because you've got this additional constraint of only having so much fabric of each fabric available to you to include in your fabric requirements, and that can really constrain the way that you can make the cuts, the techniques you can use, etc. So we're going to be talking about some strategies for dealing with all of those and just kind of some recommendations and best practices surrounding fat quarter patterns. So let's talk about dealing with the quilt math first, because this is often the most difficult part of the process. There's kind of three strategies that I have found helpful, and these are all kind of baked into my software for quilt math called Mathless Quilts. So if all of this is just like too overwhelming for you, you can check out that software and it will automatically calculate all of your quilt math for your patterns, including fat quarter patterns. It is a super, super valuable software. It speeds up the process so much. So the first kind of strategy is what I call X blocks for fat quarter, right? So you have a set of fat quarters and you're going to make a certain number of blocks per fat quarter. So if that's like just one block per fat quarter, you need basically the same number of fat quarters as you have blocks. And so for additional sizes that have additional blocks, you're just adding to the number of fat quarters that you need. You don't need to change the size of the fabric. Those are really good for scrappy quilts, but obviously if you've got like an ombre quilt, the larger your quilt goes, the more you need of each color. And so that doesn't work so well. You usually have to grow the fabric requirement per fabric versus just adding additional fabrics. If you've got like 2 or 3 blocks per fat quarter, then you can sometimes randomize those things, but this generally works really well for these kinds of scrappier quilts that are pretty typical of fat quarter patterns. So the example that I have here, this is Susie Quilt's Horizon, and it is an example of X blocks per fat quarter, although there is a little bit of an ombre scheme going on here. The fat quarter portion of this is only applicable in this kind of ombre schematic for certain sizes. So I think the baby and the throw size are both fat quarter friendly in this kind of X blocks per fat quarter scheme. Once you get to the larger sizes, you actually need like a larger cut of fabric for each different color. But basically you're making the same set of cuts from each fat quarter. You're just changing the color, essentially, is what's going on here. Now you can do this in multiple groups, right? You don't have to cut the same pieces and, the same block from every fat quarter. So if you've got multiple blocks or kind of alternate layouts, which is what you see here, right? So not every fabric is going to be cut exactly the same way, but you can sort your fat quarters at the beginning of the pattern into 2 different groups and then cut the same set of pieces from each of the fat quarters in those groups and still kind of get the math to work out pretty easily. The second kind of strategy for dealing with the quilt math is what I call exchanging fabrics. This is Mosaic Star by Lo and Behold Stitchery. And basically you've got a set of fat quarters, you're cutting the exact same pieces from each fat quarter, and then to generate each of these individual blocks, you're basically just gonna swap fabrics around. So if we kind of follow this kind of purpley pink color, you'll see it's in kind of the star points here, it's in the corners over here, it's in the center, basically corner triangles here, center triangles here, right? So each fabric is going to make an appearance in each position within the block at least once, sometimes it's 2 times, but this is a really good way to kind of randomize the fabrics and get that scrappy look without making your block math super, super complicated, because you'll just have, in this case, I think it's 16 fat quarters, and you're cutting all of the same pieces from those 16 fat quarters and just kind of doing a shuffle before you start sewing your blocks together, rather than having each individual fat quarter tied to a specific position within the block, which gets really tricky because often it's not the same amount of fabrics in each position. And also you got to keep track of which one you're cutting. You're gonna have different cutting instructions for every single individual fat quarter, which is what we're trying to avoid, right? You want to make it simple for your reader. The last kind of strategy deals with strip piecing. So if you've got a fat quarter quilt or a quilt pattern that you're trying to make fat quarter friendly and you've got to include some strip piecing in it, the thing that you need to keep in mind is that you don't always have to cut these things in the traditional kind of width of fat quarter, which would be 21 inches. So for instance, you could cut 2.5 by 18-inch strips instead of cutting them kind of perpendicular to that selvedge, which I think would be the natural direction that most people would cut their fat quarters in. And depending on what dimensions you need in your quilt, the quantities of these strip units that you need in the pattern you're working with, this might actually lead to less waste than this direction. So you kind of have to play around with that a little bit, but just don't forget that you have that option, because it can be the difference between fitting everything on the fat quarter and not fitting it on the fat quarter, which is major when you're trying to write a fat quarter pattern. So now that we've talked kind of math strategies, let's talk about some best practices when dealing with fat quarter patterns. So the first thing is to try and write all of your cutting instructions on a fat quarter basis, right? So even if you've got two groups of fat quarters, you could have an instruction to say, sort your fat quarters into a set of 15 and a set of 10, right? Or 5 or whatever it happens to be. And then for the group 1 fat quarters, you're going to have one set of cutting instructions per fat quarter, right? So you're going to take each fat quarter and you're going to cut all of these pieces from it from each fat quarter. And then you would go to group 2 and you would have the same thing, right? So even if you've got multiple fat quarter groups, you still want to write all of your instructions in a per fat quarter basis, rather than here are all the pieces that you're going to need for your quilt. Go figure out how to kind of divvy them up between your fat quarters. That's not good, right? You want to have this as simple as possible. Along with that, if you have kind of sets of pieces within your fat quarters, so if every block needs 4 2.5-inch squares and 1 4.5-inch square, and those are supposed to match, you need to say that, right? So as they're cutting their fat quarter, you need to say, hey, keep these pieces together, keep those pieces separate, right? Here's how you're going to kind of sort and shuffle your fabrics, rather than them just cutting pieces and throwing it all into a pile and then having to figure out how to separate that later. It's a pain in the butt, and I see this frequently. So if they're meant to stay together, tell your reader that when they're cutting the pieces, not later in the pattern as you're sewing the pieces together. Then it's too late. They've already kind of mixed up all of their pieces and they've got to go through this additional work of resorting them again, which is a pain in the butt. So if they're meant to stay together, tell them that as they're cutting the pieces so they can make decisions about how they're keeping their pattern organized right then and there. If you're doing fat quarter patterns, more than likely you are also going to need a cutting diagram for your fat quarters. Now there are a couple of specific cases where that's not required, which we'll talk about in a minute. But as a general rule, if you're not sure, most of the time with fat quarter patterns, you're probably going to need a cutting diagram. The cases where you don't is if you can cut basically with a fat quarter strips and then subcut everything and get all the pieces you need from that. There's no wonky cutting. So here's what I mean by wonky cutting, right? I can't cut a width of fat quarter strip at, if this is 4.5 inches for the A pieces. If I cut that strip, now I can't get any of my C and D pieces there, right? So I have to keep that in mind. And more than likely, I am going to basically cut A plus B with strip and then lob off this piece that I'll subcut into my A and B pieces, and then I'll lob off this next section, right? It gets a little bit more complicated than just cutting with the fat quarter strips down into smaller pieces. This isn't really something that can be communicated in a cutting table very easily. You really need a diagram to show these things and to keep that in mind as they're making those cuts. And so if you have this kind of configuration across your fat quarter, you definitely need to include a diagram. If it's just with the fabric strips, right, like I can cut this A strip and then subcut down, you don't strictly need your cutting diagram. You can omit it there, right? Because that's something you can sufficiently explain with just a regular written instructions in your cutting table, similarly like we do to yardage. That's fine. You may still want to include it just because the visual is helpful, especially for fat quarter patterns, but it's not strictly required until you kind of start to get these wonky shifted pieces in order to get everything to fit. When you have that case, you absolutely need to have a cutting diagram. It is not optional, it is required. On the cutting diagram, I also really strongly recommend putting kind of the dimensions of the fat quarter so that people know which orientation they're making the cuts from and where on the fat quarter they're supposed to cut these things from. Fat quarters are not square, obviously, but they're close enough to square that it can be really easy to get mixed up between which direction goes where, especially if the quilt shop wasn't super precise when they cut these things apart, if they're cutting their own fat quarters. So having those dimensions that really leave no doubt about which direction you're supposed to lay out your fat quarter and start making these cuts is really helpful. You're also going to want to label the pieces on those diagrams. Again, with a lot of fat quarter patterns, you're going to end up with a set of pieces from each fat quarter, which will kind of be the feature fabric, and then you're going to pair those with the background fabric. There's generally enough pieces in these instances where you want to have those kind of labels for each cut, and I will link to the video where we explain more about this here. But if you are using labels, which I recommend that you should, you want to put those labels in your cutting table, but you also want to label the actual pieces on the cutting diagram as well, so that it visually kind of helps you make that connection a little bit easier. I have seen some folks that will try to put the dimensions of the pieces on the cutting chart as well. If you got really big pieces, that's feasible and it can be helpful, but generally speaking, if you're cutting smaller pieces, you've got to make this diagram enormous to even be able to see those dimensions, and it just clutters up the diagram a ton. So I would recommend just putting kind of the piece labels there, and then the way that you link those two dimensions is through your cutting table. Cleans up the diagram, makes everything easier to see, and makes folks way less likely to kind of confuse which is what. As you're kind of laying out the pieces on your fat quarter, I also really strongly recommend to leave basically a 1/2 inch of excess on each side, right? So top side and right side, you basically never want to be needing a full 18-inch width or a full 21-inch height, because then we're talking about basically exact measurements there. And if you've got a fat quarter that's even the slightest bit wonky, you're SOL, especially if the kind of requirements are really tight on that fat quarter to begin with. So I always recommend my clients to never, ever, ever have their pieces going all the way to the edge in one direction or the other. Always leave kind of at least a 1/2 inch buffer there. That's kind of best practice in order to make sure that your customers always have enough fabric. The next best practice is to make sure that you write instructions on a per block basis. Again, because not all of the blocks are going to be the same here. That's kind of a hallmark of a fat quarter pattern. A lot of times you are doing kind of this fabric swapping or making a set of blocks in one color and the same set of blocks with the same instructions in a different color, right? And so to kind of keep everything easy to follow, I have found it's best in fat quarter patterns to kind of write all of your instructions going through the process for one block. And then you will basically tell your reader to repeat those instructions for each additional block with the additional caveat of switching fabrics. A lot of times when you do it this way, it's also helpful to have a section at the beginning of the pattern where you instruct your reader how to sort their fabrics. So if they're making sets of fabric for blocks, kind of in that swapping fabric scheme, right? You're going to need 5 A pieces and 4 B pieces and 2 C pieces, right? And within each of these labels, the pieces are supposed to match, but across them, you're free to mix up. And so it's having kind of that sorting section at the beginning where you kind of make each of these individual block sets pairs really well with this whole like per block instruction basis. And basically all you have to do at the end is just tell them to repeat this process with each of their block sets they've already pre-sorted. No confusion, no mix-ups, no like accidental non-randomization problems where they've got multiple of the same fabrics in one block where it just doesn't look right. Any of that business makes this process really simple. It's much easier than telling them to make, 128 flying geese in sets of 4 matching colors, right? Or something like that, and then have to later find those sets again in order to pair them up for the block. The last kind of best practice is to color code your assembly diagrams. So if you are in kind of that swapping fabrics case where you've got like 5 different feature fabrics that are all coming from fat quarters, and you want to randomize those a little bit so you've got multiple colors within the block, but kind of each position is supposed to match. So if I kind of go back here, right, you've got 5 or 6 different color positions in there. And so everything in kind of these corner squares is supposed to match, but that's supposed to be a different color than the star points and so on, right? Anytime you're in that case, in your color assembly diagrams, you kind of want to color code each of those positions so that you can show them all being different colors, even though they're actually coming from the same set of fabrics, so that it's kind of visually easier to see what is supposed to match and what is not supposed to match within a block. Obviously, with additional blocks, those colors are going to swap, right? That doesn't matter. You're only going to show assembly for one block. So kind of keep that coloring scheme consistent throughout the assembly diagrams, and then the only time that it changes is when you have kind of that final quilt top assembly, and then you can show multiple blocks in different colorways. Alrighty, that is all I've got for today. If you liked this video and found it helpful, make sure you like and subscribe, and let me know what you want to see in the future, because I've got lots of ideas, but I want to make sure that this stuff is helpful for you.